The Battle of El Alamein, fought in the arid deserts of North Africa, was one of the most decisive battles of World War II. It marked a turning point in the Western Desert Campaign, where Allied forces, led by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, halted the advance of the Axis powers commanded by Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. The battle was brutal, intense, and deadly, leaving thousands of soldiers on both sides dead or wounded in the scorching sands. But even after the guns fell silent and the war moved on, something remained in the deserts around El Alamein. The sands, it is said, never truly settled. The area became known not just for its strategic importance and historical legacy, but for the ghostly apparitions and phantom echoes that continued to haunt the dunes long after the battle ended. Locals, veterans, and travelers passing through have all reported eerie encounters that defy explanation. Spectral tanks moving silently across the sands, ghostly battalions marching under the moonlit sky, and strange, unexplainable noises carried on the desert wind. These stories paint a picture of a battlefield where the past is never far away, and where the echoes of war continue to resonate, even decades later. Here are some of the most chilling tales I uncovered during my journey through the sands of El Alamein, a journey that took me deep into the desert and deeper still into the mysterious phenomena that linger there. Story 1. The Phantom Tank of Tel El Isa. The battle at Tel El Isa was a pivotal moment during the Second Battle of El Alamein. Located to the north of the main front line, this area became the setting for one of the fiercest confrontations between the Allied and Axis forces. The terrain was unforgiving: vast, open stretches of desert, rocky outcrops, and searing heat that battered both men and machines. During the intense fighting, countless tanks and vehicles clashed, leaving behind twisted wrecks that dotted the landscape like the forgotten skeletons of ancient beasts. Many soldiers lost their lives here, their remains scattered across the sands or buried in shallow graves, only to be unearthed years later by shifting dunes. Even after the war ended, it seemed the battle had not truly left Tel El Isa. Reports of phantom tanks began to emerge, first whispered by locals, then shared by travelers and veterans who had returned to visit the battlefields. These sightings, described as spectral visions of old wartime tanks moving silently across the sands, gave rise to tales of desert phantoms, lost spirits still fighting a war that had ended decades ago. The locals had a name for them, whispered only with reverence: the Iron Shades. I had the privilege of meeting Ahmed, a Bedouin who had spent his entire life navigating the deserts around El Alamein. His family had lived on these lands for generations, witnessing the battles that had raged across the sands during World War II and the quiet stillness that settled after the soldiers left. For Ahmed, the desert was a place of memory, a vast eternal expanse that held the stories of those who had come before. He had grown up hearing tales of the Iron Shades, but he never truly believed them until he experienced it himself. We met one evening near his home on the outskirts of El Alamein, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of deep orange and purple. The wind was cool, carrying with it the scent of the desert, and Ahmed's eyes glinted in the fading light as he began to speak. It was late, just after sunset, he said, his voice low and steady, as if recounting a secret. The desert is different at night. It becomes quiet, too quiet. The wind dies down, and you can hear every little sound, every whisper carried across the sands. Ahmed had been traveling to a neighboring village to visit family, riding his camel along a familiar path that cut through the dunes near Tel El Isa. He had made the journey countless times, and he knew the terrain well: the curves of the dunes, the rocky outcrops, and the small patches of scrub that clung to life despite the arid conditions. But that evening, something felt off. The air was heavy, and there was a sense of anticipation, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I was almost halfway there, Ahmed continued, his eyes distant, as if seeing the scene play out once more before him. I had stopped for a moment to let my camel rest when I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard in years. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to come from nowhere. Ahmed had lived long enough in the desert to know the sounds of the wind, the shifting of the sands, and the calls of nocturnal animals. This was none of those things. It was deeper, more mechanical, a continuous, rolling noise that grew louder with each passing second. My first thought was that it must be a convoy, he said, glancing at me with a faint smile. Maybe some military vehicles passing through, but I quickly realized that didn't make sense. There was no reason for a convoy to be out here at this time of night, and besides there were no lights, just darkness. Ahmed strained his eyes, peering into the gloom, and that's when he saw it, a dark shape moving slowly across the dunes, silhouetted against the dim, starlit sky. At first, he thought it was a boulder or some other natural feature, but then it began to move, gliding across the sand in a smooth, deliberate motion. As it drew closer, the shape became clearer, and Ahmed's heart began to race. It was a tank, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A Sherman tank, just like the ones I had seen in the old photos from the war. But it wasn't normal. It was moving, but there was no dust, no engine noise, just that strange, low rumble. The tank rolled across the desert, its treads cutting through the sand, yet it left no tracks. Ahmed watched, frozen in place, as the tank's turret slowly turned, scanning the horizon as if searching for an unseen enemy. For a moment, he thought he could see figures inside the tank, faint, shadowy shapes moving behind the glass, but when he blinked, they were gone. I wanted to turn and run, he admitted, but I couldn't move. It was like I was stuck, like my feet were rooted to the sand. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the tank vanished behind a dune, and the sound stopped. Ahmed stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence that had settled over the desert. There was no sign of the tank, no tracks, no indication that anything had been there at all. But Ahmed knew what he had seen, and he would never forget it. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it, he said. I asked some of the older men in my village, and they told me stories about the Iron Shades, the tanks that still roam the desert, even though the war is long over. As I spent more time in El Alamein, I began to hear more about the Iron Shades, stories that had been passed down through generations, growing and evolving with each retelling. The legend of the Iron Shades was well known among the Bedouin and the locals who lived near the old battlefields. It was said that these phantoms were not just random apparitions, but the echoes of tanks that had been destroyed during the battle, their crews lost in the chaos of war. The spirits of these tanks, and perhaps the souls of the men who had operated them, were said to still haunt the desert, forever reliving their final moments. I learned that the first reports of the Iron Shades began to surface not long after the battle had ended. Soldiers who had been stationed at nearby outposts claimed to have seen tanks moving across the dunes late at night, their silhouettes barely visible against the horizon. These sightings were often dismissed as hallucinations or tricks of the light. After all, the desert was known for its mirages, and the intense heat could play havoc with a person's senses. But as the years passed, the stories became more frequent, and they were no longer confined to soldiers. Bedouin traders, tourists, and even the occasional journalist reported seeing the same thing: phantom tanks moving silently across the sands, their outlines flickering like a mirage, only to disappear without a trace. I managed to track down Ali, an older man who had spent much of his life traveling the desert as a guide. He had heard countless tales of the Iron Shades, but what he told me was one of the most chilling stories I had heard. It was many years ago, during a sandstorm, Ali said, as we sat under a canvas tent, sheltering from the midday sun. A group of British veterans had come to visit the old battlefields, to pay their respects to the men they had fought alongside. They hired me to take them to Tel El Isa, and we set out early in the morning. But halfway there, a storm rolled in, a big one, the kind that can bury a person alive if they're not careful. The group had taken shelter in an abandoned bunker, waiting for the storm to pass. The wind howled outside, rattling the metal and filling the air with the sound of sand scraping against concrete. But in the midst of the storm, Ali heard something else, a faint, rhythmic rumble, like the sound of tank tracks grinding against the earth. The veterans heard it too, he said, his eyes narrowing as he remembered. They looked at each other, and I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew that sound. They had heard it before, in the middle of battle. One of them whispered, "They're coming." Ali and the veterans peered out through a crack in the bunker wall, and there, through the swirling sand, they saw it. A line of tanks, moving slowly across the dunes, their forms barely visible through the storm. The tanks were moving in perfect formation, their turrets scanning the horizon as if preparing for combat. It was like a scene from the past, Ali said, his voice barely audible. Like the war was happening all over again, right in front of us. We watched them for what felt like hours, but when the storm cleared, they were gone. No tracks, no sign that they had ever been there. The veterans were shaken, and some of them refused to speak about what they had seen. But one of them, an old tank commander named Sergeant McAllister, told Ali something he would never forget. He said, "They're still out there, still fighting. They'll never stop." The stories of the Iron Shades have puzzled many over the years. Some believe that they are simply the result of hallucinations brought on by the harsh conditions of the desert. Heat, dehydration, and the isolation of the endless sands can do strange things to the mind. Others think that the sightings might be a form of time slip, where the past and present momentarily overlap, allowing glimpses of events that happened long ago. But there are those who believe that the Iron Shades are something more. Spirits, perhaps, or echoes of souls that were never able to find peace. The tanks, after all, were not just machines. They were crewed by men who fought, lived, and died together. For many of these soldiers, their tanks were their homes, their last line of defense, and their final resting place. There are also local legends that speak of a curse that was placed upon the battlefield by those who had suffered there, condemning the souls of the lost to roam the desert forever. It is said that the tanks and their crews were bound to the sands, unable to move on, because they had been denied a proper burial, their bodies left to wither under the scorching sun or buried beneath the shifting dunes. I spoke with Dr. Hassan, a historian who had spent years researching the Battle of El Alamein and the stories of the Iron Shades. He had heard all the theories, and while he was skeptical of the more supernatural explanations, he admitted that there was something deeply unsettling about the reports. "There's a psychological aspect to it," he said. "These men went through hell. They lived in their tanks, fought in them, and in many cases died in them. The bond between a soldier and his machine is strong, and it's possible that, on some level, that bond lingers even after death. The tanks, in a way, became extensions of their spirits." Dr. Hassan's words stayed with me as I continued my journey through El Alamein. I began to see the desert not just as a place of history, but as a vast, open grave, one that still held the memories, the fears, and the echoes of the past. One of the most compelling encounters with the Iron Shades came from Youssef, a night watchman who worked at a small military museum on the outskirts of El Alamein. Youssef was a pragmatic man, not given to flights of fancy, but what he experienced one night changed his perspective forever. "It was around midnight," Youssef said, as we sat in a dimly lit room filled with relics of the war. The museum was quiet, and I was making my rounds, checking the displays. I had just finished locking up when I heard something outside, this low, rumbling noise, like an engine. Youssef thought it was strange. There were no vehicles scheduled to arrive, and the road leading to the museum was empty. Curious, he stepped outside, and that's when he saw it. A Sherman tank, parked just beyond the fence, its turret pointed towards the building. "It looked like it had just rolled off the battlefield," he said, his voice shaking. "Covered in sand, with dents and scratches all over it. But there was no driver, no crew, just the tank, sitting there, as if it was waiting for something." As Youssef stood there, staring at the tank, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air around him grew colder, and for a moment he thought he could hear voices, faint, indistinct, like the whispers of men speaking to each other in hushed tones. "I don't know how long I stood there," he said. But then the tank started to move. It backed up, turned, and slowly rolled away, disappearing into the darkness. I ran after it, but by the time I reached the road, it was gone. No tracks, no sign that it had ever been there. Youssef reported the incident to his supervisor, but no one could explain it. The area was searched, but there were no signs of any vehicles, and the security footage showed nothing but darkness. But Youssef knew what he had seen, and he has never forgotten it. "They're still here," he said quietly. "The tanks, the men, they're still out there, wandering the desert. Maybe they're looking for a way home, Or maybe they're just waiting for the war to end. The Iron Shades of Tel El Asa are more than just ghost stories. They are the echoes of a past that refuses to fade, the remnants of a battle that scarred the desert and the men who fought there. Whether they are spirits, hallucinations, or something else entirely, they serve as a haunting reminder of the cost of war, the lives lost, the souls left wandering, and the memories that linger long after the fighting has stopped. As I left El Alamein, the sun rising over the dunes and casting long shadows across the sand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something extraordinary, a glimpse into a world where the past and present are forever entwined, where the Iron Shades continue their eternal patrol, searching for peace in a desert that holds their secrets. Story 2. The Phantom Battalion of Kidney Ridge. Kidney Ridge was one of the most fiercely contested areas during the Second Battle of El Alamein. For days, it was the site of relentless fighting, where Allied forces, primarily British and Australian troops, faced off against the formidable German and Italian divisions under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The ridge was strategically important, providing a vantage point over the surrounding desert, and both sides were determined to control it at any cost. The battle for Kidney Ridge was brutal. Soldiers fought through the searing heat of the day and the frigid cold of the desert night, enduring artillery bombardments that tore through their ranks, leaving craters that scarred the landscape. The ridge became a graveyard, littered with the wreckage of tanks, spent shells, and the bodies of those who would never return home. In the years that followed, the battlefield was cleared, and the dead were buried in military cemeteries. But those who have ventured near Kidney Ridge in the decades since the war ended tell stories of phantom soldiers who still walk the sands, trapped in an endless loop of combat, as if the battle never truly ended. These are the tales of the Lost Battalion, a spectral force that emerges from the desert mist, forever marching towards a victory that remains just out of reach. I met Omar, a seasoned tour guide, in a small cafe near the entrance to the El Alamein War Museum. Omar had been guiding visitors through the battlefields around El Alamein for more than 2 decades, sharing the history of the war with tourists, veterans, and military enthusiasts from around the world. But when I asked him about Kidney Ridge, his usual cheerful demeanor darkened, and he became noticeably more subdued. "Kidney Ridge is different," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I've taken many groups there, and everyone can feel it, the heaviness, the weight of the past. It's like the air is thicker there, and sometimes you hear things that shouldn't be there." Omar's first encounter with the phenomenon known as the Phantom Battalion happened over a decade ago. He had been leading a small group of tourists to the ridge, walking them through the events of the battle, when they heard something that made them stop in their tracks. "It was just after noon, and we were standing near the top of the ridge," Omar recalled. "I was explaining how the Allied forces had pushed the Germans back, pointing out where the different units had been positioned, when one of the tourists, a man from England, asked me if there was a reenactment happening nearby." Omar was puzzled. There were no reenactments scheduled, and the area was deserted except for their group. But as he listened, he heard it too, a faint, rhythmic sound that grew louder with each passing moment. It was the unmistakable cadence of marching boots, the crunch of sand beneath heavy, military-issue footwear. The group fell silent, straining to hear the sound. It was distant but clear, like an army on the move, accompanied by the faint jingle of metal and the murmur of voices. As they looked out across the ridge, they could see nothing but empty desert, stretching out to the horizon. Yet the sounds continued, growing louder and more distinct, as if an entire battalion was marching just out of sight. "We all just stood there, listening," Omar said, his voice low. "No one said a word. It was like the sound was coming from the past, echoing through time. I could almost see them, the soldiers, marching in formation, rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces set in grim determination. But there was nothing there, just sand." The group stayed for a while longer, listening to the eerie sounds of the Phantom Battalion until they eventually faded into the silence of the desert. But the experience left them shaken, and many of the tourists later confided in Omar that they had felt a chill run down their spines despite the midday heat. "I've heard it a few times since then," Omar said, gazing out the window as if he could still hear the distant march. "Always the same, marching, voices, the sound of metal clinking. But when you look, there's nothing there. It's like they're still out there, still marching, still fighting a battle that ended long ago." Omar wasn't the only one who had experienced the eerie phenomena at Kidney Ridge. I also spoke with Sergeant Mark Reynolds, a former British soldier who had returned to El Alamein several years after the war to visit the battlefields where he had fought. Mark was a no-nonsense man, skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by logic or reason, but even he had encountered something on the ridge that defied explanation. "It was late," Mark said, lighting a cigarette and leaning back in his chair. "I had gone out there on my own, just to have a bit of quiet. It's hard to explain, but when you've been through something like that, you feel a connection to the place. I wanted to see it again, to remember the lads who didn't make it." Mark had been sitting near a small outcrop, gazing out at the desert under the light of the full moon, when he noticed something strange. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the shadows, a flicker of movement near the edge of the ridge. But as he watched, he saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, moving in a loose formation across the sand. "They were soldiers," Mark said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "I could see their helmets, their uniforms. They were carrying rifles, just like we did back then. But there was something off about them, like they weren't quite real." Mark's heart began to pound as he watched the figures move silently across the ridge. They made no sound, no crunch of boots on sand, no rustle of fabric. But as they drew closer, he could see their faces, young, pale, and expressionless, their eyes staring straight ahead as if they were focused on something only they could see. "It was like they were in a trance," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just marching, endlessly, without a word. I tried to call out to them, but they didn't respond. They just kept walking, past me, through me, like I wasn't even there." Mark was left standing in the moonlit desert, his breath caught in his throat as the figures marched on, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the ridge. He stayed there for a long time, trying to make sense of what he had seen, but there was no explanation that made sense. "It was like they were still on patrol," he said finally. "Still doing their rounds, even though the war was over. I don't know if they were real, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I'll never forget it." Mark's story was one of many I heard about the night patrols that still haunt Kidney Ridge. Visitors to the area often report seeing shadowy figures moving across the sands at night, their forms barely visible in the darkness, as if they are still carrying out their orders from decades ago. Some believe that these are the spirits of soldiers who died during the battle, unable to rest because their mission was never completed. Others think they are simply echoes, the remnants of a time when the ridge was alive with the sounds of war. One of the most chilling accounts of the Phantom Battalion came from Colonel James Brooks, a retired officer who had fought at El Alamein and returned many years later to pay his respects to the men who had served under him. Colonel Brooks was a respected figure, known for his bravery and leadership, but when he spoke of Kidney Ridge, there was a sadness in his eyes that hinted at memories he wished he could forget. "The ridge was hell," he said bluntly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "We were under constant bombardment, artillery shells exploding all around us, machine guns firing from every direction. We lost a lot of good men up there, too many." Colonel Brooks had been leading a platoon during one of the final assaults on the ridge, pushing forward through a hail of bullets and shrapnel. The fighting was intense, and the ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both Allied and Axis soldiers. But despite the chaos, Brooks remembered seeing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We were pinned down, trying to find cover behind a ridge of rocks," he said. "I looked up, and I saw them, an entire battalion, charging up the hill. British uniforms, rifles at the ready, bayonets fixed. They looked like they were about to break through the enemy lines, but they weren't real." Colonel Brooks watched in disbelief as the Phantom Battalion surged forward, their figures shimmering in the sunlight, translucent and ghostly. The soldiers moved with precision, their faces set in grim determination, but there was no sound, no gunfire, no shouts, just the eerie silence of a charge that had been lost to history. "I don't know what I was seeing," he said, shaking his head. "Maybe it was a memory, or maybe it was something else, but I could feel it. The desperation, the fear. It was like they were still trying to take that hill, still trying to finish the fight, even though they'd been dead for years." The vision lasted only a few moments before the battalion faded, dissolving into the heat haze that rippled across the desert. But Colonel Brooks never forgot what he had seen, and he was convinced that the spirits of those men were still out there, reliving their final moments over and over again. "They're stuck," he said quietly. "Stuck in a battle that never ends, and I don't know if they'll ever find peace." During my stay in El Alamein, I heard numerous accounts of the Phantom Battalion, but one of the most striking stories came from Anna Turner, a travel journalist who had visited the region to write an article about the historical significance of the battle. Anna had been skeptical of the ghost stories she had heard, dismissing them as local legends designed to attract tourists. But her own experience on Kidney Ridge left her with more questions than answers. "I was there to take photos," Anna said, showing me a series of black and white shots of the ridge. "I wanted to capture the landscape, the feeling of the place, you know? It's so quiet now, so peaceful, and it's hard to imagine what it must have been like during the battle." Anna had spent most of the day exploring the ridge, photographing the old trenches and bunkers, but it wasn't until dusk that she encountered something truly unusual. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, she noticed a strange movement in the distance, a line of dark shapes, barely visible against the fading light. "At first, I thought it was just rocks or shadows," she said, her eyes narrowing as she tried to recall the details. "But then I realized they were moving, marching, like soldiers on patrol. I could see their outlines, their helmets, not even the glint of metal on their rifles." Anna raised her camera, snapping a few shots of the figures, but when she looked through the viewfinder, the shapes were gone. Confused, she lowered the camera and saw them again, moving steadily across the ridge. She took another photo, but once more, the image showed nothing but empty desert. "It was the strangest thing," she said, showing me the photos she had taken. "You can see the landscape, the sand, the rocks, but no soldiers. And yet, I know they were there. I could see them with my own eyes." Anna's encounter with the Phantom Battalion left her shaken, and she ended up cutting her trip short. She never published her article about El Alamein, but she kept the photos as a reminder of what she had seen. "I don't know if they were real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me," she said softly. "But I felt something out there, something that wasn't quite right. It's like the past is still alive on that ridge, like the battle is still happening, even though there's no one left to fight it." The phenomenon of the Phantom Battalion has been the subject of much debate and speculation. Some believe that these apparitions are the echoes of a traumatic event, a kind of psychic imprint left behind by the intensity of the battle. Others think that they are the spirits of soldiers who died on the ridge, unable to move on because they were never able to fulfill their final mission. Dr. Khalid Mansour, a psychologist who has studied the impact of war on mental health, offered a different perspective. "War has a way of imprinting itself on a place," he said. "The fear, the adrenaline, the sheer will to survive, it's a kind of energy, and sometimes that energy lingers. The soldiers who fought at Kidney Ridge were under immense pressure, facing almost certain death, and that kind of intensity doesn't just disappear. It stays, like a scar on the landscape." Mansour suggested that the sightings of the Phantom Battalion might be a form of collective memory, a manifestation of the unresolved trauma that the battle left behind. "It's not just about the soldiers who died," he said. "It's about the way we remember them, the stories we tell, and the way those stories shape our understanding of the past. The Phantom Battalion might be a way of keeping that history alive, even if it's unsettling." The Phantom Battalion of Kidney Ridge is more than just a legend. It is a reminder of a time when the sands of El Alamein were soaked with blood and the air was filled with the sounds of war. For those who have seen them, The specters of these soldiers are not just ghosts, but echoes of a past that refuses to fade, a testament to the sacrifices made by men who fought and died in a distant desert far from home. As I stood on the ridge, the sun setting behind me and the wind whispering through the empty trenches, I couldn't help but feel that I was not alone. The shadows stretched long across the sand, and for a moment I thought I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of marching boots, the distant murmur of voices carried on the wind. The battle may have ended, but for the Phantom Battalion, the war never truly stopped. They are still out there, marching through the sands of time, forever searching for a peace that eludes them, even in death. Story 3. The Haunting of the El Alamein War Cemetery. The El Alamein War Cemetery is one of the most solemn and poignant places in North Africa, a sprawling sanctuary of peace amidst the harsh, unforgiving desert. Here lie the graves of over 7,000 Allied soldiers, men from the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Greece, and other nations who fought and died during the Western Desert Campaign of World War II. Their names are engraved on white headstones, aligned in neat rows that stretch across the sands, each marking the final resting place of someone who once fought under the relentless sun, their lives cut short by the brutal reality of war. The cemetery is meant to be a place of reflection, a place where visitors can pay their respects to the fallen, but for many, it is also a place of profound mystery. Over the decades, countless visitors, caretakers, and locals have reported strange phenomena. Disembodied voices, shadowy figures that seem to drift among the graves, and the haunting sound of a bugle playing a mournful tune, even when no one is there. These eerie encounters have led many to believe that the souls of the soldiers who rest here have not found the peace they deserve. Some say they are waiting for someone. Others believe they are still carrying out their duties, standing watch over their fallen comrades, even in death. The Phantoms of El Alamein, as they are sometimes called, are a testament to the enduring scars of war, a reminder that even in a place of rest, the echoes of battle can still be heard. I met Mariam, one of the longtime caretakers of the El Alamein War Cemetery, on a bright, cloudless morning. Mariam was a quiet, unassuming woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. She had been tending to the cemetery for nearly 20 years, ensuring that the graves were well kept and that the grounds were immaculate. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a hint of reverence as she described her work. But when I asked her about the rumors of hauntings, her expression changed, and a shadow seemed to pass over her face. "I don't like to talk about it much," she said, glancing down at the freshly cut grass. "But there are things that happen here that I can't explain. I'm not the only one who's seen it. We all have, at some point." Mariam's first encounter with the supernatural presence in the cemetery occurred on a cool autumn evening several years ago. She had been finishing her rounds, making sure that everything was in order before heading home, when she heard a sound that made her stop in her tracks, the sound of someone crying. It was so soft, almost like a whisper, she said, her eyes distant as she recalled the memory. "At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was the sound of a man weeping." Mariam followed the sound, her heart pounding as she made her way through the rows of headstones. The cemetery was deserted, and the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the graves. The crying grew louder as she approached a solitary headstone near the edge of the cemetery, marked with the name Private James Collins. "He was just a boy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 19 years old, from Australia. "I've looked after his grave for years, and I've always felt a kind of sadness when I'm near it. But that night, it was different. It was like he was there, right in front of me, crying." Mariam looked around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. The cemetery was empty, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the wind. But as she stood there, she felt a chill run down her spine, and the air around her grew cold, despite the warm evening. "I could feel it," she said, her hands trembling slightly, "like someone was standing right next to me, crying. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there." Mariam left the cemetery quickly that night, her heart heavy with a sadness she couldn't explain. But the experience stayed with her, and she found herself returning to Private Collins' grave more often, leaving flowers and saying a quiet prayer for the young soldier who had died so far from home. "It's strange," she said, smiling sadly. "Ever since that night, I haven't heard the crying again. I don't know if it's because he found some peace or if it's just that he doesn't want to show himself to me anymore. But I still feel him sometimes when I'm there, watching, waiting." The Alamein War Cemetery has another enduring mystery: the sound of a bugle playing a mournful, haunting melody that echoes through the rows of headstones even when there is no one to play it. This phenomenon has been reported by numerous visitors over the years, and it always seems to happen at the same times: dawn and dusk, the traditional moments for the last post, a bugle call that signals the end of the day and honors the fallen. I first heard about the Phantom Bugler from Lieutenant John Hughes, a retired British Army officer who had visited the cemetery during a trip to Egypt. Lieutenant Hughes had served in the military for over 30 years, and he was well acquainted with the traditions and ceremonies of remembrance. But what he experienced at El Alamein left him with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. "I was there early in the morning," Hughes said, his voice steady but solemn. "Just before sunrise. I wanted to pay my respects to see the graves of the men who fought here. It's a quiet place, peaceful, but there's also a weight to it, like the air is thicker there." As Hughes stood by one of the rows, reflecting on the sacrifice of the men buried there, he heard the faint, clear notes of a bugle drifting through the air. The melody was slow and sorrowful, the kind of tune that brings a lump to the throat and makes the heart ache. It was a sound he recognized instantly: the last post. "I thought there must be some kind of ceremony going on," he said, frowning slightly. "Maybe another visitor paying tribute. But when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. The cemetery was empty." Hughes listened as the bugle call continued, the notes echoing softly across the graves, and he felt a chill run through him. The sound was beautiful, yet deeply sad, like a farewell to something precious that had been lost. "It played all the way through," he said, "and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited for a while, thinking someone might appear, but no one did. It was like the music had come out of nowhere." Hughes later asked the cemetery staff if there had been any ceremonies scheduled for that morning, but they told him there were none. There were no buglers on site, and no one else had reported hearing the music. "I don't know what to make of it," he said, shaking his head. "But I think it was a kind of salute, a final tribute to the men who never got to come home. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was something else, but whatever it was, it felt right, like the war wasn't quite over and someone was still out there, keeping watch." The stories of the Phantom Bugler have persisted over the years, and those who have heard it often describe feeling a sense of comfort, as if the music is a way of saying goodbye to the soldiers who rest in the cemetery. For some, it is a sign that the men are not forgotten, that their sacrifice is still remembered, even if only by a spectral bugler who plays a tune that echoes through the sands of time. Another story from the El Alamein War Cemetery involves a presence that many have come to call the Silent Sentinel. Unlike the Weeping Soldier or the Phantom Bugler, this presence is not heard but seen, a solitary figure who is often spotted standing at the edge of the cemetery, as if keeping watch over the graves. I spoke with Youssef, a local man who had worked as a groundskeeper at the cemetery for nearly a decade. Youssef was a practical man, not prone to superstition, but even he had seen things at the cemetery that he couldn't explain. "It was during my first year working here," he said, as we walked through the rows of headstones, the desert wind rustling through the flowers left by visitors. "I was doing the night shift, just making sure everything was secure. It was a clear night, with a full moon, so the whole place was lit up, almost like daylight." Youssef had been making his way along the perimeter of the cemetery when he noticed a figure standing near one of the gates, perfectly still, as if carved from stone. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark uniform, and appeared to be looking out over the graves, as if on guard. "I thought it was a visitor who had stayed too late," Youssef said, "so I walked over to ask if he needed help, but as I got closer, he just disappeared." Youssef was startled, but convinced he must have been seeing things, perhaps a trick of the light. But then, A few nights later, he saw the figure again, standing in the exact same spot, facing the same direction. This time, he was sure it wasn't just his imagination. He was there, Yusef insisted. Clear as day, standing at attention like a soldier on duty. I tried to get a closer look, but every time I moved towards him, he would vanish. Yusef began asking his colleagues if they had ever seen the figure, and to his surprise, many of them had. The silent sentinel had become something of a legend among the cemetery staff, a guardian who appeared to keep watch over the graves, especially on nights when the wind was calm and the moon was bright. I think he was one of them, Yusef said softly, looking out over the rows of headstones. A soldier who never left his post. Maybe he died here, or maybe he came back to make sure his friends were safe. But whatever the reason, he's still here, keeping watch. The stories of the silent sentinel have spread beyond the cemetery staff, and some visitors have even reported seeing the figure themselves. For those who believe in the presence, he is a comforting sight, a symbol of loyalty and duty that endures even beyond death. During my time at the cemetery, I encountered another haunting story, shared by Paul Harris, a British historian who had spent years researching the Western Desert Campaign. Paul's work had brought him to Alamein many times, and he was well acquainted with the history of the battles that had taken place there. But it was during one of his research trips that he experienced something that left him questioning everything he thought he knew. I had been going through some old war diaries, trying to piece together the final movements of a particular regiment. Paul said, as we sat in a quiet corner of the cemetery's small visitor center. There was one name that kept coming up, Sergeant Michael Thompson. He had been reported missing during the first battle, presumed dead, but his body was never found. Paul had become fascinated by Thompson's story, and he had hoped to learn more about the man who had disappeared into the sands of El Alamein, leaving nothing behind but a name on a missing persons report. One evening, he decided to visit the cemetery, hoping to clear his head and find some inspiration. It was late, just before sunset, Paul said. I was walking along the rows, thinking about Thompson, when I noticed a figure standing near one of the memorials. He was wearing an old British Army uniform, and he was just standing there, looking out at the graves. Paul was curious, but as he approached, the figure turned and began walking away, heading towards the edge of the cemetery. Paul followed, calling out to the man, but he didn't respond. When the figure reached the gate, he paused, turned, and for a brief moment, Paul saw his face. It was like looking at a photograph from the 1940s, Paul said, his voice barely audible. The uniform, the haircut, everything. He looked at me, and I could see. I don't know how to describe it. There was a sadness in his eyes, like he was looking for something or someone. The figure disappeared before Paul could reach him, leaving him standing alone by the gate, his mind racing. He later found a photograph of Sergeant Thompson, and his heart nearly stopped when he realized that the man he had seen looked almost exactly like the photograph. I don't know if it was him, Paul said, shaking his head, but I like to think it was. Maybe he was trying to find his way back, or maybe he was just saying goodbye. I'll never know for sure, but I'll always remember that look in his eyes. The phenomena reported at the Alamein War Cemetery have been the subject of much debate and speculation. Some attribute the experiences to psychological phenomena, the result of visitors projecting their emotions and memories onto a place that is steeped in history and loss. Others believe that the sightings and sounds are a kind of residual energy, a lingering presence that has been imprinted onto the land by the trauma of war. Dr. Amina Khalil, a cultural historian, has studied the way in which places of great historical significance can become imbued with a sense of haunting. War cemeteries are not just resting places, she said. They are sites of memory, of mourning, and of unresolved grief. The men who are buried there are often far from home, and the people who visit these sites bring their own emotions with them. It's possible that what people are experiencing is a kind of communion with the past, a way of connecting with something that is still very much alive in our collective memory. For some, these encounters are comforting, a sign that the soldiers of El Alamein are not forgotten. For others, they are a reminder of the unfinished business of war, a conflict that continues to echo through the sands, even decades after the last shot was fired. The phantoms of El Alamein War Cemetery are more than just ghost stories. They are echoes of a past that continues to resonate, a testament to the men who fought and died in a faraway desert, and who may still be waiting for a peace that has yet to come. From the weeping soldier to the silent sentinel, each of these spectral figures embodies the enduring presence of history, a presence that cannot be easily silenced. As I walked through the cemetery one last time, the sun setting behind the distant dunes, I felt a profound sense of connection to the men who lay beneath the sand, their names carved into white headstones that glowed in the fading light. The wind whispered through the rows, carrying with it the faintest hint of music, a melody that was both mournful and beautiful, like a bugle call that signaled the end of the day, but not the end of the story. For at El Alamein, the past is never truly gone, and the spirits of those who fought there will continue to stand watch, keeping their eternal vigil over the sands of time. Story 4. The Desert Mirage, Apparitions of the Western Desert. The desert stretches endlessly around El Alamein, a vast expanse of sand and rock that seems almost timeless. It's a place where the sun beats down mercilessly during the day, and the cold creeps in under the cover of night. For those who fought in the Western Desert Campaign, the terrain was as much an enemy as the opposing forces. The harsh environment tested the endurance of soldiers and machines alike. During the fierce clashes between the Allies and the Axis, the desert became a stage for a different kind of battle, a place where strategy, courage, and sheer survival determined the outcome. But long after the dust had settled and the wreckage of tanks and artillery had been cleared, the desert refused to let go of the memories of those dark days. Over the decades, there have been countless reports of apparitions, phantom convoys, mysterious lights, and even shadowy battalions marching through the desert at night. These sightings have been described by locals, veterans, and travelers alike, leading to a series of chilling tales about the desert mirage, a phenomenon where the past appears to bleed into the present, where the ghostly remnants of war can still be seen haunting the sands. The first story I heard about the desert mirage came from Captain Robert Sinclair, a British veteran who had served in North Africa during the Western Desert Campaign. Now in his late 80s, Captain Sinclair was visiting El Alamein for what he said would likely be the last time, a chance to pay his respects to the men he had served with and to remember the battles that had shaped his life. We met at a small cafe near the railway station, and though his hands shook slightly as he lifted his cup of tea, his eyes were sharp and clear, as if the memories he carried were still fresh. "It was 1942, he said, his voice steady, despite his age. "I was stationed near Mersa Matruh, just west of El Alamein. We were expecting a resupply convoy, tanks, fuel, ammunition, the whole lot. It was supposed to come through at night under cover of darkness, but they never arrived. The convoy had been crucial. Without it, Sinclair's unit would be left vulnerable, unable to mount a defense against a possible Axis advance. When the convoy failed to show up, he and a few others were ordered to go out and find out what had happened. They set out at dawn, following the route that the convoy was supposed to have taken, but as the hours passed and they saw no sign of it, Sinclair began to fear the worst. We were about to turn back, he said, his brow furrowing as he remembered. And then, just as the sun was starting to set, we saw them. In the distance, a line of trucks and tanks was moving slowly across the sand, heading straight towards them. Sinclair and his men waved, signaling to the convoy to stop, but there was no response. The vehicles kept moving, their outlines blurry in the heat haze, as if they were barely there at all. "It was like looking at a mirage," Sinclair said, shaking his head. "We could see them clear as day, tanks, trucks, even a few armored cars. But there was something wrong. They were moving too smoothly, too silently. There was no dust, no roar of engines, just nothing." As Sinclair's team watched, the convoy continued to approach, but just before it reached them, it veered off, turning to the north and disappearing behind a ridge. Confused and uneasy, they decided to follow, hoping to catch up and find out what had happened. But when they reached the ridge, the convoy was gone. There were no tracks, no tire marks, nothing to suggest that any vehicles had been there at all. "We searched for hours," he said quietly, "but there was nothing. It was like they had vanished into thin air." Captain Sinclair later learned that the convoy had been ambushed by Axis forces several miles away, and all the vehicles had been destroyed. The men driving them had been killed, their bodies left in the desert, and their supplies lost. For years, Sinclair wondered if what he had seen was just a mirage, a trick of the desert, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something more. "I think they were trying to make it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "trying to complete their mission, even after they were gone. Maybe they didn't know they were dead, or maybe they just didn't want to leave the job unfinished. I don't know. But I'll never forget the sight of that convoy, moving silently through the desert like they were still on patrol." Another well-known phenomenon associated with the desert mirage is the appearance of strange lights, seen flickering in the distance near the Alamein Ridge, a location that played a crucial role during the Second Battle of El Alamein. These lights have been described as faint, ghostly glows that appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly, often seen late at night when the desert is at its most still. I spoke with Samir, a local Bedouin who had been traveling the deserts around El Alamein his entire life. Samir's family had been nomadic for generations, and they knew the desert better than anyone. He had grown up hearing stories about the lights, but it wasn't until he saw them himself that he began to take the tales seriously. "It was about 10 years ago," Samir said, his eyes narrowing as he remembered. "I was out with a few of my cousins, setting up camp for the night near Alamein. We had just finished eating and we were sitting around the fire when one of them pointed to the horizon and said, 'Look.' Samir turned and saw a faint glow in the distance, like the light of a lantern bobbing gently in the dark. At first, he thought it was another group of travelers, maybe soldiers on a night patrol. But as he watched, the light grew brighter, then dimmer, pulsing rhythmically as if it was signaling something. "We thought about going to check it out," Samir said, "but then the light started to move, quickly, darting across the horizon like it was being carried by the wind. It didn't make sense. There was no way a person could move that fast, not on foot, not in the dark." The light continued to move, zigzagging across the desert, before suddenly disappearing, leaving Samir and his cousins staring into the empty night. They waited for it to reappear, but it was gone, as if it had never been there. "I've seen those lights a few times since," Samir said, glancing at the darkening sky. "They always seem to show up in the same place, near the ridge. Some people say it's just a mirage, a trick of the eyes, but I don't know. I've heard stories about men who died out there, alone, and whose spirits still wander, looking for a way home." Samir's story is one of many. The lights have been seen by soldiers, tourists, and locals alike, and while no one knows exactly what causes them, there are plenty of theories. Some believe they are phantom lanterns, carried by the spirits of soldiers who died in the desert, still trying to find their way back to camp. Others think they are echoes of flares fired during the battle, their light somehow preserved in the sands of time, replaying endlessly in the dark. One of the most chilling tales of the desert mirage involves the Shadow Battalion, a spectral force that is said to appear during sandstorms when visibility is low and the wind howls across the dunes. This battalion is described as a line of dark, indistinct figures, moving steadily across the desert, their forms barely visible through the swirling sand, like shadows cast by an unseen light. The first account of the Shadow Battalion one came across was from Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, a German veteran who had served under Rommel's Afrika Korps during the Western Desert Campaign. Lieutenant Hoffmann had been stationed at a remote outpost near Katara, where he and his unit were tasked with maintaining a supply line. One night, during a particularly fierce sandstorm, he saw something that he would never forget. "The wind was brutal," Hoffmann said, his eyes dark with the memory. "It was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you, and the sand was cutting into our skin like knives. We had been ordered to hold our position, but we were completely blind, just waiting for the storm to pass." As Hoffmann stood outside his tent, shielding his face from the wind, he noticed a group of figures moving through the storm, heading straight towards their camp. At first, he thought it was reinforcements, but as the figures drew closer, he realized there was something wrong. They weren't walking normally, he said, his voice hushed. It was like they were gliding, like their feet weren't even touching the ground. And they were silent, no sound of boots, no clinking of equipment, just shadows. Hoffman watched as the figures passed by the camp, their outlines barely visible through the swirling sand. He tried to call out to them, but his voice was lost in the storm, and the figures continued on, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. "We searched the area the next morning," he said, shaking his head. But there was nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. It was as if they had never existed. Hoffman later learned that the area around Katara had been the site of several fierce skirmishes, and that many soldiers, both Allied and Axis, had died there, their bodies buried by the shifting sands. He became convinced that what he had seen was not a hallucination, but the shades of those lost men, still marching through the desert, still following orders that no longer mattered. "The desert doesn't forget," he said quietly. "It holds on to everything, the good, the bad, and the dead. And sometimes, I think it gives us a glimpse of what it's holding." During my journey through El Alamein, I had the chance to speak with Linda Matthews, an American journalist who had traveled to Egypt to write a piece on the battlefields of the Western Desert. Linda had planned to focus on the history of the area, but her trip took an unexpected turn when she experienced something that she struggled to put into words. "It was my last day there," Linda said, as we sat in a quiet corner of the El Alamein War Museum. "I had been out taking photos of Tel El Asa, trying to capture the landscape, and I decided to stay until sunset. There's something about the desert at that time of day. It's almost otherworldly." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes, Linda noticed a faint movement in the distance. At first, she thought it was just a gust of wind stirring the sand, but then she realized she was looking at a line of soldiers, moving in perfect formation, marching towards the ridge. "They were so far away, I could barely make out their shapes," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "But I could see their helmets, their rifles, everything. It was like watching a parade, but there was no sound, just silence." Linda raised her camera, snapping a few shots, but when she looked at the images later, there was nothing there, just the empty desert stretching out under the fading light. Confused, she scanned the horizon, trying to catch another glimpse of the soldiers, but they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. "I don't know what I saw," she said, shaking her head, "but I don't know how to describe it, like I was looking at the past, like I had somehow stepped into a moment that wasn't mine. I've heard about the desert mirage, but I always thought it was just a myth. Now, I'm not so sure." The sightings associated with the desert mirage have puzzled and fascinated people for decades. Some believe they are the result of atmospheric conditions, a kind of natural projection caused by the unique combination of heat, light, and wind in the desert. Others think they are residual echoes, moments of intense emotion and trauma that have been imprinted onto the land, replaying endlessly like a looped film. Dr. Olivia Rees, an anthropologist who has studied the folklore of the Western Desert, offered an intriguing perspective. "The desert is a place of extremes," she said. "Extreme heat, extreme cold, and extreme isolation. When people are pushed to their limits, their senses can play tricks on them, but that doesn't mean what they're experiencing isn't real. The desert mirage might be a manifestation of the collective memory of the people who have passed through this place, soldiers, travelers, and nomads. It's a way of preserving their stories, even after they're gone." Dr. Rees suggested that the desert mirage could be understood as a kind of time capsule, a phenomenon that allows people to catch glimpses of the past, even if only for a moment. "It's as if the desert is trying to show us something," she said. "Something we've forgotten, or maybe something we've tried to forget. But the desert doesn't forget, and it doesn't let go. The past is still there, buried under the sand, waiting to be seen." The desert mirage of El Alamein is more than just a series of ghost stories. It is a reminder that the desert is not a place of emptiness, but a place filled with memories, a landscape that holds onto the past and refuses to let it fade. From the phantom convoys to the mysterious lights, each sighting is a glimpse into a time when the sands were alive with the sounds of war, and the men who fought there were struggling to survive. As I stood on the ridge at Tel El Asa, the wind whispering through the dunes and the sun sinking low on the horizon, I felt a sense of awe and a sense of sorrow. The desert was quiet now, but I knew that somewhere out there, the echoes of the past were still moving, still marching, still fighting. The war may have ended, but the phantoms of Alamein are still out there, wandering the sands, caught in a moment that will never be over. And for those who have seen them, they are a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that some battles are destined to be fought forever. The deserts of El Alamein are a place where the past and present coexist, where the echoes of war still reverberate through the sands, and where the spirits of those who fought and died continue to haunt the land they once defended. From the phantom tanks of Tel El Asa to the weeping soldier at the war cemetery, these stories are a reminder that the scars of war are not easily forgotten, and that the souls of the fallen may still linger, searching for peace. As I left El Alamein, the sun setting behind the distant dunes and the wind whispering through the empty desert, I couldn't help but feel that I had witnessed something extraordinary, a glimpse into a world where the past refuses to fade, where the spirits of the desert phantoms still roam, and where the echoes of the Battle of El Alamein continue to haunt the sands.